Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Emma Stone, and I'm so excited to be joining you today from up north in Glasgow. I might not be the Emma Stone you were expecting, but I hope to still make a good impression nonetheless. Today, I want to introduce you to the very detailed but critically under-researched topic of amber in Egypt's New Kingdom. Now, the title side of this presentation is a little misleading. While this project is dealing with amber in Egypt's New Kingdom, up until now, there has not been any amber ever chemically identified and published in Egypt before the arrival of the Romans. This presentation is going to walk you through about why that's a unique thing in the Bronze Age and why studying amber in Egypt can help give us an understanding into how such an internationally shared material was understood in Egypt compared to the other cultures it existed in. I unfortunately don't have time to go through all aspects of my thesis. So today, I'm just going to focus on a major case study that has persisted in archaeology amber research throughout the decades. Egypt was no stranger to adapting foreign goods and materials to fit their own cultural needs, which would mean that adapting a foreign material like amber might be expected of them, given the status it would attain among Mycenaean palatial elites, as well as its potential appearance as a diplomatic gift exchange in Mesopotamia. However, because of the lack of modern chemical testing that has been done on resin-like materials in Egypt, there is little discussion about amber in Egypt. In fact, most of the discussion points towards Egypt not having amber based on the limited and rudimentary chemical analysis that has been conducted. I disagree with this ideology and would like to present an alternative argument today. It is my belief that regardless of whether amber existed in Egypt, the Egyptians would have more than likely been exposed to it given the sheer quantity of it in Mycenaean Greece and its existence in Mesopotamia as well. If they knew about it, then they may have also understood its symbolic meaning in these regions. I want to explain to you why it does not necessarily matter whether Egyptians had loads of amber. What matters is that they had materials that were introduced during the New Kingdom, such as resin being used as jewelry and ornaments instead of incense or varnish, that they could have considered as amber, regardless of its true identification. Now, before we begin, I want you to imagine a piece of amber in your mind. Think of its color, its translucency, and I want you to keep that image of amber in your mind for the rest of this presentation. There. Now, to start this presentation, I would like to take you outside of the New Kingdom and introduce the first known recorded term for amber in an Egyptian context, which also explains the title of this presentation. Pliny the Elder, in his chapter on amber in his Naturalis Historia, cites a source from Nicias that has unfortunately not survived, where he mentions that amber formed in Egypt is called sacal. Despite this text being written well after the end of the New Kingdom, it has been a starting point for archaeologists trying to find if the Egyptians had ever described amber in an Egyptian form, rather than only understanding it through foreign terms. While I don't have the time to take you through the linguistic side of this project today, I will show you the potential Egyptian interpretations of amber in some of their material culture, both foreign and domestically produced. Talk about amber in Egypt during the Bronze Age, I must briefly establish how big of an impact amber made on the rest of the Bronze Age landscape. Amber is a kind of fossilized resin that formed from ancient tree sap millions of years ago. Amber, primarily Baltic amber from the Baltic Sea in Scandinavia, has been in use abundantly since the Stone Age. However, this little bear amulet is one of the oldest examples of amber use, carved as recently as 3900 BC or as long ago as 12,500 BC, originating in a submerged settlement in the North Sea off the coast of Denmark. Baltic amber is the most abundant amber found in Europe, both past and present. Early archaeologists used an acid in the amber called succinic acid to test resin-like artifacts they found to determine if the amber was Baltic or not. In the last century, technological advances were made to identify amber chemically through infrared spectroscopy, which I won't go into too much detail about that now, but this has allowed other ambers like Bitterfield amber and Sicilian amber to be identified amongst the Baltics. Unfortunately, no modern chemical tests have been conducted on proposed Egyptian amber, which you will understand once I introduce which artifacts archaeologists believe are amber. The tricky part of amber research comes with the identification of the material. On screen on the left are pictures of various Congolese and Ethiopian fossilized resins, both polished and unpolished. Samples B, D, and E are all unpolished raw pieces of amber. As you can see, despite them being amber, the unpolished piece of amber from the Congo, which is sample B, compared to the unpolished Ethiopian pieces D and E, make it look very difficult for a novice to know exactly what they're looking for. On the right are examples of the kind of color spectrum you can expect when looking for amber. Pieces typically range from an almost complete white yellow to a near black red. On much rarer cases, they can also come in shades of blue and green, as seen from sample F on the left-hand side. Now, amber is primarily identified through minimally invasive infrared spectroscopy called FTIR analysis. However, I would like to make it clear with my approach that chemical results are not the determining factor in understanding how Egyptians might have used amber. It all comes down to the physical characteristics. Now that you've seen some raw amber, I want to introduce amber in the Bronze Age specifically. I have 3 pictures of examples of amber found in Bronze Age contexts from the European and Western Asian landscapes. On the left is a lion head vessel carved and found in a ziggurat in Assur. The next piece is a string of Baltic amber beads found in a burial in Mycenaean Greece. And on the right is a bead found in Denmark. All 3 are beautiful examples that represent the type of materials you would come across when you're investigating Bronze Age amber. Their find locations also demonstrate just how far amber traveled during the Bronze Age, because all 3 of these are confirmed to have been made with Baltic amber from the Baltic Sea. The lion head in particular is a perfect piece of evidence to suggest that amber could have made its way into Egyptian culture as well during this time, because of the lengths it traveled to reach Mesopotamia. The lion head is also unique because it has been theorized that given the Mesopotamian stylistic look of the lion, it probably arrived as a raw material and was later carved into the vessel you see on screen, probably through some form of diplomatic gift exchange, which I will touch on for the Egyptian amber. To help give you an overview of amber trade, here are a couple maps detailing find sites of Baltic amber, as well as the presumed routes the amber took from the Baltic region to reach the Mediterranean. As you can see, by the Middle Bronze Age, Baltic amber had confirmed to have reached as far as Crete from somewhere in the Baltic region, showing just how widespread the distribution of this material was. You can also see the number of amber finds from the Middle Bronze Age happening in Greece specifically, making it much more likely that the exposure of this material could have begun to reach across the Mediterranean, especially with the kinds of expeditions that were happening from Egypt to the Aegean this time, like from Amenhotep III to Thutmose III. While there have been no published chemically identifications of amber in Egypt before the Roman period, there have been visual identifiers that have prompted archaeologists to investigate materials as amber. Primarily, findings from Tutankhamun's tomb have interested archaeologists since the contents of the tomb were first published. I hope it becomes a little clearer now why people have been unable to chemically test these materials. The artifacts of finding in his tomb, as summarized by Lucas, were a double finger ring, 2 large scarabs, a necklace of about 55 resin beads, another necklace of alternate resin and lapis lazuli beads, an earring made up of resin and gold beads, a broken object that was probably an earring, a hair ring, 2 knuckle bones, and the knob of a box. These materials were all varying shades of red or reddish brown, some with a flaking surface, which you can partially make out on the hair ring, that is typically associated with amber that has degraded over time. They are all still officially classified as resin, but I would like to point out details about several pieces that make them interesting in relation to amber. And on this picture of Tutankhamun's sarcophagus, you can actually see one of the scarabs that's believed to be amber and where it was positioned on the body when it was discovered. So this picture here is an illustration of double finger ring found on the body next to Tutankhamun's hand. And it is unfortunately the most detailed image I have found so far. But what I want you to take from this piece is the hieroglyphs, the royal cartouches. It is something inherently Egyptian, even if the material might not be. I'm now going to walk you through a few more examples of potential amber and explain what they represent in terms of Egypt's reception to the material. This object is one of the earrings that has the alternating gold and resin beads. You'll also notice the blue beads dangling from the hoop as well. I will admit I have only just started looking into this earring and can't confirm whether these beads are made of faience or lapis lazuli, but the color is what I believe offers an interesting insight. This is a primary piece of evidence when it comes to explaining how the Egyptians responded to this form of material. In numerous Bronze Age sites where amber has been found, it has also been found alongside blue glass. In fact, the Baltic amber bead I showed you earlier from Denmark was found on a string also containing blue glass. A recent study conducted by a Danish-French team chemically analyzed blue glass found alongside amber beads in a Bronze Age Danish burial and concluded that the blue glass had originated in Amarna. So along the amber route, finding something blue coming from the opposite end of the Bronze Age landscape is a very interesting concept. Tumulus culture graves, which I'm about to discuss, have also had finds with amber and blue glass found together. This is a recurring combination across the Bronze Age landscape, a combination that appears to be shared in Egypt. It stands as a counter-argument to the archaeologists that discredit amber-like materials once they have been determined as another resin. Even if they weren't amber, they are being used in a way that amber has been used across the Bronze Age landscape, which warrants a further investigation. This next picture shows the necklace containing 55 beads of a resin-like material. This necklace was not found on the body, and it was found in a small box in the antechamber. Carter recorded 60 beads, but mentioned that several showed signs of severe decay, and we are now only left with 55, varying in size from around 3 centimeters up to 9 centimeters. Interestingly, it has been noted in the past by archaeologist Sinclair Hood that the beaded necklace pictures bears a similar shape to confirmed Baltic amber beads that have been excavated in a grave in Schwarza in the Tumulus culture, indicating that these beads could have potentially traveled down the amber trade routes and arrived into Egypt as is. The sharp biconical shape is a key indicator of originating from a source like the Tumulus culture. And the lopsided size and shape of these beads are also an indication that these beads may have also arrived in Egypt as is, as it has been previously established that irregularly strung beads discovered in the Aegean, a key region where Egypt may have obtained amber, did not match traditional Mycenaean standards of beads ornaments. As you saw from the necklace earlier, it was very symmetrical, whereas something like this is just very non-symmetrical. This, again, could demonstrate the intermingling of foreign and domestic interpretations of the same material for the Egyptians. Amber or amber-like materials might have been considered as something valuable, whether they were made in an Egyptian context or elsewhere, given that so far we have seen both variations were buried alongside a king. Now, this is the hair ring found in Tutankhamun's tomb. It is the only resinous material I have found so far described by Carter as being possibly amber. It was also found away from the body in a box containing an assortment of materials. As you can see, the lower portion of the hair ring has heavily degraded, which is typically expected of amber. As an organic material, amber is subject to degradation just like any other biological material like wood, papyrus, and textiles. Factors like environment and exposure can worsen or lessen an amber's degradation, causing it to flake, creating a crust-like texture across the surface, such is the case with this hair ring. The final piece I'm going to show you today is one of the scarabs found on Tutankhamun's body. This was the scarab that you saw in that picture of the sarcophagus. As you can see from the color of this piece, It is darker and opaquer than you might traditionally associate with amber, but there are still parts of the scarab that demonstrate a hint of the translucency one might expect from polished amber. What is interesting about this piece, as well as the finger ring and hair ring you just saw, are their forms. We have explored how the Egyptians might have been receiving pre-made objects as potentially gifts from other cultures, just like the lion head vessel in Mesopotamia. But these specific pieces represent the other side of the lion vessel, the idea of Egyptians receiving raw chunks of amber alongside finished pieces. This scarab, for example, is something uniquely Egyptian. The second scarab, identified as a heart scarab, shows an image of the Bennu bird on its face, and on its back, spell 29b from the Book of the Dead. This is all to say that they were certainly manufactured in Egypt rather than entering the culture as a finished piece. This could display not only the kinds of materials the Egyptians may have deemed valuable for a gift exchange, valuable enough to be buried with them, but also how the Egyptians would adapt this material within their culture, combining and accepting both foreign and domestic styles in something like a funeral ritual. There are still arguments, though, surrounding whether this is genuine amber or another kind of fossilized resin, sorry. So let me explain why I don't think that matters when discussing amber archaeologically. Now that I've shown you some examples from Tutankhamun, I want to explain why objects should still be considered as amber in discussion, regardless of their chemical signature. These items were identified as resin by Carter. Not carnelian, not glass, something about it made it seem resinous, and he even labeled one as possibly being amber. Petrie is also known to have found a few beads and scarabs that he has labeled amber. Museums have Egyptian materials labeled as amber, even though they haven't been chemically tested. So why in archaeology do we have such a narrow view on amber identification that we are solely relying on chemical testing? This all leads to one of the primary approaches I'm taking towards exploring how Egyptians understood this material. Geologically speaking, there are a few variations of what a fossilized resin could mean. Typically, it refers to amber. Resins like copal, on the other hand, can be overlooked. Copal tends to be softer than amber and has a smaller degree of polymerization. While both are considered fossilized resins that were formed millions of years ago, geologists argue on whether copal can be considered amber due to these chemical variations. This is a great discussion for geologists to have, but archaeologists have started to adapt this debate into their research. Beads have been found previously in both Egypt and Mesopotamia that were originally identified as amber, but following chemical analysis were deemed as other forms of resin, including copal, thus excluding them from the amber discussion. I want my project to change that thought process. I think it's safe to assume that in the New Kingdom, the Egyptians did not have access to infrared spectroscopy technology, and therefore could not identify materials on a microscopic level the same way we can now. What they could do, however, was use the physical properties of an object to identify it, how it looked, what color it was, how durable it was, the scent it gave off when burned, if it burned at all. These were all things that the Egyptians could have taken into account when they came into contact with a material like amber. Copal is so similar to amber that it's still one of the primary materials used in faked or forged amber jewelry today. The National Museum of Scotland even has a document published on how to identify whether you bought a genuine piece of amber or something like copal. To prove how the discussion surrounding amber and other resins may have excluded several key pieces of evidence about Egypt's relationship with the material, I have this picture I showed you earlier in the presentation. I must confess, I misled you a bit again, because one of them is actually not amber. It is a piece of copal. Now, I want you all to think of that piece of amber that you imagined at the start of this presentation. Based off of the image in your head and the pictures you see on screen, can you tell which sample is not actually amber? This one is actually a piece of polished Congolese copal, not amber, despite arguably being the one that most looks like amber. I hope this can show you just how hard it can be at a glance to differentiate amber from fossilized resins, because that is exactly the archaeological point I want to make. If the Egyptians looked at a material and thought it was amber, does its true identification matter? If it was used, transformed, and incorporated into Egyptian culture with the understanding that it was a piece of amber, does its chemical composition change that? Thank you all for listening, and please enjoy a couple other beautiful pieces of amber that were found throughout the Bronze Age.
Wow, amazing. It was amazing, really. I didn't know practically anything about amber, so it was mind-blowing for me. Thank you, really. Are there any questions in the room? Since for the moment we don't have questions on the chat.
Yes, we've got some. Bente, you're at the front of the room. You get to go first.
Ooh. Well, thank you very much. That was really interesting. And firstly, not as much as a question as more as a comment. Thank you, first of all, for using so many pieces from the National Museum of Denmark. That's a collection that's very close to my heart, as I am Danish and from the land of amber. Especially the bear. That's if you haven't seen it in person, go please. It's beautiful. We have not only the glass beads, blue glass beads in the collection that stem from ancient Egypt. We actually also have a chair, a folding chair, which is a copy of a chair from ancient Egypt, which ended up in a burial mound in Denmark. So we have several references to ancient Egypt during the Bronze Age in Denmark as well. So if you didn't know that piece, you can also look into that. So, secondly, one question. I'm not sure, the scarab that you showed us, the last one, it looks like it's set in gold. And I don't know if that would make it less translucent, and that might be the reason why. So that's my question to you.
Thank you. That is a good question. I do know about the folding chairs. Yes, I found that during my master's research. But to your question, the gold should not affect its translucency too much. Obviously, it's not going to be as translucent as it would be if it was just a polished piece of amber. As you can see from the sun holder, you can see light coming in from both sides. However, if this is a piece of amber and it was polished, you should still be able to see small, I guess the best way to describe it is like pockets inside where you can see different shades of light, both darker and lighter. So it would give off some kind of translucency, even if you couldn't see light all the way through.
Thank you. Ruben was next, and then I'll come to Liv.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that. My question is around what is the definition of amber? Because when you're talking about something that's chemically tested to be amber, what is the, what's the word? What's the type specimen that resulted in that becoming amber chemically?
Sorry to interrupt. On Zoom, we have the same question. What is the scientific description of amber as compared to copal? What is amber? What is copal?
So I mentioned earlier in the presentation succinic acid, and that is one of the main things that scientists look for when confirming amber. It is primarily present in Baltic amber, but you can also find it in different variations. Like there's minor traces that you can find in, I believe, Sicilian amber. Bitterfield amber is actually very hard to tell the difference from copal or from Baltic amber because they are, with the succinic acid, chemically almost identical. Copal is not usually going to have succinic acid. The areas that they come from also help with chemical identification because they were grown in different trees several million years ago. All ambers that I have been talking about have been primarily European ambers. The Ethiopian ambers that I showed in the slide, that is still a relatively new deposit that's been discovered. So I'm hesitant to say the Egyptians might have ever had access to that amber. But copal is found throughout several regions of Africa. So it would have come from a completely different region. And also, if you're a geologist, a great way to tell if it's amber or not is if there's bugs in it. So yeah, succinic acid is one of the main factors they look for. Other than that, you need somebody who's extremely specialized to identify anything other than Baltic amber. Baltic amber has a very specific wavelength with FTIR analysis. Sicilian amber does not, and it can take a long time to identify it.
Thank you, Emma. You've answered Liv's question as well. So thank you very much for answering 3 questions in one. Anything else in the room before we go back to Valentina? Yep.
I was just wondering what drew you to amber specifically in the first place?
So it was kind of an accident. When I was looking for a master's topic, I really love looking into cross-cultural connections, how different cultures saw each other, intermingled, traded knowledge. So when I knew I wanted to do Egypt, but my program required me to talk about at least 2 cultures. So I wanted to do something long distance. So not Egypt, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece. So I just started Googling Egyptian artifacts found in the UK, Egyptian artifacts found in Ireland, and I just went across the top of Europe. And I found an article about the Danish blue glass bead when I reached Denmark. And just throughout that whole research for that dissertation, I just fell in love with amber and what's available.
Thank you so much. Anything else in the room? Yeah. Hold on a sec. Can I just give you that one?
What's the earliest confirmed amber found in Egypt?
So it wouldn't be confirmed. The earliest proposed piece is a couple beads from a pre-dynastic grave in Armant. I could not give you specifics on it, the exact date. The publication was a little lacking, but they are pre-dynastic. So there's a couple museums that have labeled as amber some pieces from the Nakada culture, so very early. But yeah, again, nothing has been officially confirmed as amber, but around pre-dynastic is when they start showing up.
Thank you so much. Last call in the room before we go back to Zoom. Anything else with you, Valentina?
We have a sort of a follow-up question about the origin of amber. It's like, so amber doesn't come from Wales like ambergris?
I think you're talking about whale bile, which I have not personally looked into. But if you're talking about genuine amber, it does come from tree sap. It's a type of fossilized resin. That's the scientific definition of amber.